There's no denying that food is a fantastic way to train your dog. If you've got a highly food motivated dog, we can teach them to do almost anything if we're doing the right things technically. But if your dog has a low food drive, which is something we see so often as dog trainers, it's so common, it's really hard to train your dog because there's nothing that they want from us. So why would they bother completing behaviors for us or changing the way that they do things? They just wouldn't. So there's a few things that need to go into this, but it's actually a lot simpler than you might think. We're not going to starve your dog, don't worry. I just want to get that out of the way to begin with. We're not going to deny your dog any of the food that it needs to survive. We are not going to take anything from them or start feeding them less until they get hungry, in terms of we're just going to not feed them for 3 days and then when they're weak and got no energy left, then we'll feed them, because that's not sustainable. It's bad for the dog's health. And if they've got no energy because they've not been eating, they're not going to be able to learn anyway. So that'd be a massive waste of time. But we are going to look at sort of setting up a structure for how we feed to make sure that we do get the most out of that drive. So there's a few things that we need in place first. And the first is a decent quality food. There are a lot of supermarket brands out there and a lot of the brands in Pets at Home, and most of them are well-known brands. As a rule, they're full of carbohydrates, they're full of stuff that's not the best for your dog, and stuff that's going to make them feel extremely full. It's going to make them feel sluggish, but then they're going to have spikes of sugar because the body breaks down those carbohydrates into glucose, so they're going to have sugar rushes and then big crashes, which means their behaviors will often be more erratic and not relative to the situation. So dogs that completely lose their mind when a guest comes over, that's going to be so much worse if they're just running on sugar. So a food that has a more protein based sort of makeup is going to be what we're looking for. Something that has at least sort of 70% protein, and then the rest of it can be made up of fruit, veg, and some carbohydrates. Carbs aren't bad for your dog in and of themselves, but they should not be the main component of the diet. If I was to tell you, you're not allowed to Google it, but you're not allowed to buy dog food anymore, and you have to make your dog's food. You can't research what you can give them. You just have to go off what you already know. The majority of people would give predominantly meat and maybe some veg and maybe some rice, things like that. But it'd be meat. Of course it would. The predators, the carnivores, well, they're omnivores now, but they're descended from predators. They're descended from wolves, and wolves don't eat many carbs. So kind of lean into that historical nature of the dog. They wouldn't be eating too many carbohydrates if they were out in the world scavenging, hunting. So yes, I know dogs aren't hunters anymore before you all start attacking me in the comments, but whatever. So once we know we've got our dog on a good food that doesn't contain anything that our dog's allergic to, we're then going to move on to making sure we're giving them the right amount. And this is where so many people fall short. There's a few things that people do wrong here that I'm going to just touch on. Firstly, people feed their dog for the amount of calories they're supposed to eat. So you need to figure out how many calories does a dog of my dog's age and size need to be eating to stay healthy. Once you know how much that is, I'm going to use the example here of 200 grams of food. So we've got them on good food and they need 200 grams of it a day to survive. It'd be a small dog, but let's just use the example. We're going to break that food up into some different portions and start delivering it differently, but we need to know that 200 is the most they're supposed to eat in a day to be at their ideal weight. Now that's important. Ideal weight, not the weight they currently are. Because if they're under or overweight, and you weigh them, and then when you look up how much your dog needs to eat per day, you put their weight in, the food that you're going to give them will keep them at that weight. And if we need them to lose or gain some weight, feeding them for the weight they are is not going to help us. Hopefully that makes sense, but I've gone to a lot of people recently that have said, oh, do you know what? I weighed him and I feed him for that. And actually that dog's a little bit on the hefty side and they need to lose a bit. So we need to bring down the amount of food that dog's eating if we're going to get them to a healthy weight and just a healthier dog in general. Once we know how much that is, we need to make sure that we're not adding in anything extra that's going to confuse our counting. So if you need to give your dog 200 grams of food a day, but you also give them some chicken and some sausages and a pig's ear and some training treats and leftovers from tea, and you just keep adding these little bits in, they're getting 200 grams of food, but then they're also getting all these extras, and as a rule the extras are going to be more desirable to the dog, so it'll bring down the value of their normal food. So for 2 weeks minimum, we're going to take everything else out of their diet that doesn't need to be there, and we're just going to give them their normal food, because that's going to make sure that we're not overfeeding. Because there might be sort of, let's say 150 calories in a pig's ear. If your dog needs 600 calories a day, and you give them 600 calories of food and then 150 calories of pig's ear, and you do that every day, you're massively overfeeding that dog over a week and over a month. And that will affect the food drive. So they can eat up to their allotted amount. So let's say it's 200 grams. We're going to feed them 200 grams a day, or we're going to offer them 200 grams a day. So we're going to split that food into four: 50, 50, 50, 50. 50 grams of food in the morning, 50 grams of food later in the morning / early afternoon, and then another 50 grams mid-afternoon, 50 grams evening, roughly. Doesn't have to be exactly those times, but you're going to spread it into 50. What this does is it makes sure when the dog does eat, it doesn't get completely stuffed and need absolutely ages to recover. Think if you've ever been to a restaurant and gone a bit daft, and you've had a starter and a main, and then you had the dessert, and you're like, oh my god, I can't move, and you're completely stuffed. It's going to be a while before you're able to eat again. We don't want our dog to get in that state. They wouldn't get themselves there naturally, so we don't want to put them there either. So we're going to spread it into four so that they eat enough to kind of keep them going and keep their energy levels good, but we're not going to stuff them. If you do it in 3 or in 2, it will still work. It's just a bit more difficult and it'll take longer because a lot of those meals might just be a bit too much for one meal. And then, of course, it's just going to make it a much longer game to get them where we want them to be. So, once we offer them meal number 1, let's say, if they say, no, thanks, and walk away from it, cool, no worries. We're going to take that food away. We're going to put it back in the bag, or we're going to wrap it up, put it in the fridge, whatever. But they're not going to get it today. So the best they can do now is 75% of those calories, 150 grams. If they refuse meal 2, cool, no worries, same again. And let's say by the end of the day, they've eaten 50% of their food. Well, that's okay. That's all they wanted to eat. We don't need to, and this is the big point, we don't need to get extra calories in them. They were offered enough calories. They refused them. They didn't need them, didn't want them. It's okay. No dog has ever starved itself, so don't worry about that. We're offering the necessary amount of calories. They're refusing. Potentially they're holding out for something fancier, some leftovers from tea, some treats, whatever. Or potentially they're just not that hungry. You will notice if you've got your dog on a higher quality of food that this is easier, because a lot of those carb heavy foods, you need to give a lot more of them. So you might have to give your dog 250 grams a day of WAG or Royal Canin, but you only need to give your dog 200 grams of a quality food, which will be better calories anyway, so they'll be healthier, but also they need less of them, so the food drive's easier to build. Sounds a bit daft, but it can actually be a lot cheaper. So a lot of these brands, so like Royal Canin's an absolute culprit for this, they're very expensive, but you have to give your dog a lot of the stuff, whereas if you have something that is maybe a little cheaper often or more expensive per bag, but the amount you give them actually goes down because they don't need as much of that food to maintain their health, and they don't feel as stuffed off it either. So this works both ways. Once we're into this sort of routine, to begin with, we're just going to offer it them at home. We're not going to do anything fancy with it. We're just going to offer them the amount that they need. If you want to do it in a bowl, that's fine for now. Once they start to realize, oh, there isn't any extras coming, I'm not going to get anything fancy, then they should start to see more value in their normal food. And we can bring those treats and stuff back in later, don't worry. But for now, this is the structure that we need to follow to get your dog's food drive up. Once we've given them 25% of their food, and we've done that for 2 weeks, you need to track how much of it they ate on each day. So if they ate 50% one day, 40%, 60%, 80%, 20%, 50%, whatever, you just need to keep a track of it, and you should see that percentage rise because they're starting to realize that the other stuff isn't coming, but also they realize that I can't just leave it and come back to it later. And also because they are having a better quality food, this number should come up anyway. If it isn't coming up after 2 weeks, you maybe need to look at reducing their overall calories because you might have miscalculated a little bit. If they're eating all of it every single time straight out the gate, we maybe need to add 10% on because we don't want to underfeed or overfeed. And the numbers that you're going to get off any of the calculators online are only going to be guidelines. They don't know your dog. They don't know their metabolism. They don't know their exercise. They don't really know enough. So it's always guidelines, okay? Once they're eating just about every single meal every time, you can maybe have the odd time where they miss one meal or they're just not interested in one meal. But majority of the time, 9 times out of 10, they're eating every meal. Then we're going to move to hand feeding. So we don't need to do anything fancy with it, but for 3 to 4 days, You're going to start offering the dog the food from your hand. This is fantastic for relationship building, but also it sets the tone for us starting to use the food for training. We don't need to do anything with it, just offer them the food. If they eat it, they eat it. If they don't, they don't. It's great for bonding. It's just a good way to interact with your dog. Same process, but now the food isn't in a bowl, it's in our hands. Once they're eating all of it out of our hands, we're going to move on to moving into maybe a garden or the front of your house. Rinse and repeat the same process. If you have a dog, but this is really important, if you have a dog that is hyper fearful and is completely unable to eat outside, seek a trainer. Stop watching this video now, because you could starve your dog because they're too terrified to eat outside. If, however, you have a fairly normal dog, a fairly sort of regulated dog, this should work just fine for you. Once they're eating it all in the garden or on the front of your house or on the drive, increase that to out on walks. Once they are doing really well with that, we're going to start asking them for behaviors for that food, or we're going to start rewarding behaviors we see with that food, and that's where you start to tip into the using food for training. And now just imagine, once your dog is taking all of the food that we need them to eat, or they need to eat outside, what you'd be able to achieve if you started to use some treats here and there. When you do start putting the treats back into the diet, make sure you take them from the calorie allowance. This is super important. So if you're going to give your dog 200 grams of food, but you're going to take 50 grams of treats out, make sure you only give them 150 grams of food that day. Sounds obvious, but it's one of those things that's just easy to kind of overlook. I've seen loads of people do it, and it's fairly easy done. So that's how we're going to build. That's how we're going to build our food drive with our dog. That's how we're going to get them more interested in food. This can take, depending on the dog, a couple of months. I've got a couple of dogs I'm working with at the minute. It took less than a week, and the dogs are already starting to eat all of their food. I've got a few dogs that I've worked with in the past, a couple that were rather overweight and that had been eating rubbish food and then gone off it and then been being fed, like cooked meals every day, and even then they weren't eating it all. I've seen it take up to a couple of months, but by and large, this should be a month maximum, and you should start to see really, really high increased food drive in your dog. If you're finding that it's just not working whatsoever, it may be worth consulting the vet and just checking that there's nothing wrong, because all of this will not work if there's something wrong with your dog. So it's probably worth just keeping an eye on. If there's no increase after a week or so, maybe it's worth to have that chat with your vet just to make sure. So I really hope this was really helpful for you guys as dog owners that want to train your dogs with food. And for any of you guys that I'm going to be working with in person, obviously this video is going to be massive for you. If I do have a session coming up with you, this video, start doing this now, because it'll save us loads of time in sessions later. So really hope you enjoyed that. Really hope it's useful. We do also have a food tracker that we'll be launching soon that will help you do this, but just keep a track of how much they actually eat, so you know if it's going up or down, because that's so important. Thanks very much, guys. We'll see you in the next one.